Hi everyone and welcome back to my booktube channel, Lisa in Bookland. Today I'm going to bring you my March reading wrap up. All of March I was taking part in the Irish Readathon and I actually read predominantly Irish books for the whole month, which was really different and a real treat. And the only book I read that wasn't Irish is parts of Don Quixote by Cervantes, which is obviously Spanish, which I'm reading as part of a long-term readathon. Yeah, everything else I read was Irish, apart from maybe one possible exception which I'll talk about later. So I read 10 books in March in total. So the first few books I'm going to mention, I'm not going to go into them too much in depth because I talked about them already in my St. Patrick's Day reading vlog, and I'll link it down below. The first book I'm going to talk about is The Charnell House by Eamonn McGrath. This book is set in a tuberculosis sanatorium in the 1950s. I suppose one thing I didn't mention in that vlog is maybe you might want to consider whether you want to read this book now or not if you had a bad experience with COVID, because obviously it is about patients suffering from a very serious pulmonary illness. But I really enjoyed it. I'd thoroughly recommend it to anyone that's kind of interested in medical history, as it was fascinating from that perspective. And the author of this book actually was in a TB sanatorium himself for 3 years. Obviously he did recover. He actually dedicates the book for the few who survived and in memory of the many who did not. So yeah, I suppose a nice dedication, an excellent book. I really enjoyed it. And that book was to fulfill the prompt for the Irish Readathon to read a green book. So the next book is actually green as well, though I read it for the prompt to read a children's book, and that's The New Policeman by Kate Thompson. Oh, I love this book. It was a favourite from my childhood as well, and I'd highly recommend it. It's about this village in Galway called Kinvara, and this boy called JJ Liddy, his mother for her birthday asks if he can get her more time, and time is such a big part of this book. The town is running out of time, and it's getting worse, and there's kind of a magical element for as well, or a mythological element. So yeah, I just love the way it's told. Like Kate Thompson's writing is so good. Another nice thing about this book is it's kind of filled with traditional music. Like, I used to play violin. It really made me itch to pick it up again and have a go at some trad, so maybe that'll happen someday. But yeah, this is a great book. I'd highly recommend it. So the next book then was a prompt to read a book that was recommended by one of the readathon hosts, Aoife from Words of Clover and Leanne from Leanne Rose, and this book was recommended by Aoife, and it is A Ghost in the Throat by Doireann Ní Ghríofa. So I really wanted to get to this book because it won the An Post Irish Book Awards last year, and was talked about a lot. So yeah, I just wanted to see what it was all about, and it was definitely worth reading. It was very different, but I did enjoy it. It's kind of autofiction, and it's about this new mother who discovers this lament by a woman back in the 17th century that was written in Irish. Yeah, an interesting read. Not for everyone, I'd imagine, but it definitely, I enjoyed it. So the other book I talked about then in that reading vlog was the group read for the Irish Readathon, which was Boys Don't Cry by Fíona Scarlett. It was a good reading weekend. I enjoyed that book as well. It's a contemporary about these two brothers. The younger brother, it's obvious, is very sick, and it's told in two timelines. The first is from the perspective of the older brother who's dealing with the younger brother's sickness, and then the other timeline is from the younger brother, who I suppose is a lot more naive. So it is a bit of a tearjerker. I'm not one to cry at books, but if you do, it definitely would get some out of you, I'd say. For some reason going in, I expected it to be a children's book, but it's definitely not. It's an adult's book. And then the last book I talked about in that reading vlog was The Sunken Road by Ciarán Menamin, which I read to fill the prompt for a book set in Northern Ireland. Again, two timelines. The first timeline is kind of set in Ireland in 1921. It's told from the perspective of Francie, who is in the IRA and on the run from the authorities, and also there's a second timeline which is very much about Francie also and his friend Archie, but it's set in the First World War in France. So yeah, I really enjoyed this exploration of like those early days of Northern Ireland, when there's kind of a running thing throughout the book that nobody knows where the border is, and they're dealing with that. And then the First World War timeline as well is gripping. It's very clear from the start of the book that Archie didn't actually survive the war, so but the reason why isn't revealed straight away. You really have to live that through the second timeline. So yeah, no, great book for anybody that's interested in any of those things. So another prompt was to read a book set in the 1920s. I did read more than one book for this prompt. So the Sunken Road that I just talked about would fall under this umbrella, but I did read two separate books. So the first book I'm going to talk about is The Winter Guest by W.C. Ryan. So on the whole, I'd say I loved this book. There was an awful lot in it. It's centred around this big house, as the cover would indicate, called Kilcolgan House. And first thing I'd like to say is the book is really atmospheric. It's kind of set in winter, as the title implies, and it's near the sea, so it's very foggy and isolated. So the daughter of the house actually gets murdered very early on in an IRA ambush. She's in the car with what we call a blackened hand and also a local policeman. To an outsider, it would appear that Maud was caught in the crossfire, but actually the prologue shows that somebody actually murdered her and took something from her. So it's really a mystery as to why that happened. I found the mystery enthralling and really and the conclusion really satisfied me a lot. I thought it was great because Maud actually had sympathies with the IRA, and there's some dispute about what actually happened. This man called Tom Harkin gets sent to Kilcolgan to investigate. He is part of the IRA. He gets sent by his bosses to go and find out what happened because there's other activities happening around there. To add further complications, Tom used to be engaged to Maud, and also he used to be an officer in the British Army during the First World War, so there's a lot of flashbacks to that. So there's a lot of interpersonal drama going on, there's a mystery going on, there's a load of other characters. Some of them are really good. I really liked the other characters. Tom Harkin is investigating because, for his own reasons and for the IRA's reasons, but also obviously a prominent member of society is being killed, so there's other people investigating, and how they all get on with each other was interesting. And what I really enjoyed about this book is kind of the way it described how the IRA was actually ran down the country during the 1920s. There's also a bit of a kind of a ghost story in it as well. I suppose one kind of thing that really annoyed me from the time I bought the book and I'm still annoyed about it now. So the blurb says, January 1921, though the Great War is over in Ireland, a new civil war is raging. So admittedly my eyes did skip over the exact date, but I found it very confusing that it said it was about a civil war. As much as I could look up, I couldn't find any references to like Irish War of Independence, as we'd call it, being called a civil war. So that's very confusing. Civil war in Ireland very clearly means like what happened after Irish independence between the pro-treaty and anti-treaty forces. So I did kind of email the publisher, which I've never done before. I was just kind of so vexed over it, I decided to do it, and I disappointingly I didn't receive a reply. But it just leads confusing. At the start I was just wondering, I was reading and I'm like, oh, is there going to be like a second timeline, or is it going to start off in the War of Independence and it's going to fast forward 2 years, and it didn't happen. And then I was like, oh, I went to look at the date and I was like, oh, January 1921, that makes sense. But yeah, it just seems like unneeded confusion, to be honest. So that's The Winter Guest by W.C. Ryan. I still would recommend it. It was a good book. So the next book was also set in the 1920s, and that's The Informer by Liam O'Flaherty. Yeah, this book was grand. It kind of passed me by, really. It's more kind of a thriller than I'd be used to. So it's about this man called Jippo. As the title is evident, he informs to the police on a friend how he tries to escape what he's done. What was interesting about this book, I thought that Jippo was part of an IRA organisation, but actually he's part of a communist organisation, which I've never read anything about communism in Ireland in fiction before, so that was interesting. It was grand. I wouldn't go out of my way to read it again. The next book, I suppose, is also recommended by Aoife from Words of Clover, and I just read it because I had it on my shelf, and that's Strange Flowers by Donal Ryan. It's hard to know how much to say about this book without giving anything away, but at the very start it's about this girl called Moll. It's probably set about like 1940s, 1950s rural Ireland. Moll runs away from home for reasons not disclosed. First half of the book probably follows her family as they try to deal with that. and then after a few years Moll comes back, and how the community and how the family react to that. I will say I was kind of more interested in Moll's family than in Moll herself. You know, I think I just liked reading about rural Ireland during that time and kind of the various peculiarities of it. So there's a quote at the back of the book that says, I think you have to truly love people to write like this. And I think that really is a great thing to say about this book. Like, the characters, you do really understand all of them. All of them are so different and complicated, and some of them you don't like very much, like maybe Moll, but yeah, no, they're still written really well. So I think if you're into characters, this is a great book. Yeah, no, I enjoyed it, but it's not one of my top reads of the month, I suppose. So the prompt to read a non-fiction book, I actually ended up reading two different books than I expected to read for this prompt, and that is for a specific reason, I suppose. So if you thought I could go through a whole month of Irish reading without reading anything about ships, like, you'd be forgiven for thinking I could. But this book was on my shelf, and at the start of March they rediscovered the wreck of the Endeavour. So I had this book on my shelf called Tom Crean: An Illustrated Life. So this is the book that I kind of cheated on, because the author isn't actually Irish, Michael Smith. I thought he was, but he's not. But the man it's about, Tom Crean, is. He was from Anniscull in County Kerry. So this was an absolutely fascinating book. It's I haven't read a lot about like Shackleton's expeditions or that, but Tom Crean joined the British Navy when he was young. I think he was like 15 or 16, and he actually went on like 3 of the 4 major voyages of exploration to the Arctic. And received, you know, loads of medals and that. When he did end up having to retire back to post-independence Ireland due to an injury, he moved back to Anniscull and opened up a pub called the South Pole Inn, but he never, you know, spoke about all of the things he'd done, I suppose because it was so complicated politically to be talking about your time in the British Navy. But he also seems to have been quite a modest man, but quite a character, and it's very clear throughout this book that he was kind of relied on a source of good humour, especially in hard times. And there's one point where they're making this impossible 17-day journey in Arctic waters in these small boats, and he's in charge of the James Caird. And somebody says about him, one of the memories that comes to me from those days is of Crean singing at the tiller. Nobody ever discovered what the song was. It was devoid of tune and as monotonous as the chanting of a Buddhist monk at his prayers, yet somehow it was cheerful. So obviously he was singing in Irish, and nobody could understand him. So that's just I suppose a nice little story. But yeah, such an inspirational book, as I always find any of these books about explorers, superhuman people. Yeah, just the bravery and ambition of people, albeit obviously not always for the right reasons or good reasons. It's just still that, you know, that these things could have been achieved by real people is amazing. So it is just unbelievable. Although he didn't keep a diary or anything, there's loads of kind of testimonials from men he served with that speak very highly of him. Some very nice quotes like Crean is perfectly happy, ready to do anything and go anywhere. The harder the work the better, and that was by Captain Scott that said that. There was so many exploits that are recounted in this book. It's amazing the weights they had to drag. One of the most famous things he did, he was returning to their ship on the Terra Nova expedition with another man and an officer called Lieutenant Evans, and Evans was very sick with scurvy. They'd already been dragging him on a sled for days and days and days, and it was decided they wouldn't be able to make it all together. So Crean said that he'd go alone. He took like a few squares of chocolate and walked for 35 miles with like no navigational skills whatsoever to get help when he was already extremely fatigued. What it says in the book, what it says in the cover, really describes all. As so the Irish Independent says it was about a great Irishman that didn't have to die to become a hero. So I believe that Tom Crean is kind of more well known in Ireland now. I was actually rooting around and I found this poster I'd kept, so I guess I was impressed by him even before I read that book. So I don't know when it exactly is from, like the early 2010s, I think. But yeah, so he kind of came to prominence when there was a documentary made about him. But yeah, definitely deserves to be taught in Irish schools, I suppose, just to kind of emphasise that Irish people, you know, did have a role in world events and important discoveries, not only within Ireland. So yeah, no, a great book. This is the illustrated version, which I'd highly recommend. There's like a smaller version, you know, that doesn't have the pictures in, but the pictures were amazing. And honestly, I could look at the pictures of this book all day. So I did read another non-fiction book that was written by an Irish person. So just a very small little one, but I'm actually not going to say the title of that. It's actually about my local town. It's a very, very local history book, so I'll keep that one to myself. But it was interesting. So it covers kind of a period between like the late 1700s and early 1900s, and it was just really interesting to see such a local focus and the changes that happened, and even what streets used to be called and where they came from. And it also is kind of about the local gentry. The house is gone, but it's interesting to see what they contributed to the town and the mark that they left. So yeah, no, it was nice. So I'd say my top read of the month, and it's actually the first one, it wasn't for any specific prompt, but it was just such a good read, and that's Circle of Friends by Maeve Binchy. Maeve Binchy is a very well known Irish author, but I've never read anything from her before. So the first thing I love about this book is the cover. So what I love is when books actually, like, it's obvious from, you know, the setting and the characters in the front. The character Jack has an actual like UCD coloured scarf. I went to college in Dublin, so I know what they look like. I love when books have a special cover painted for them. It's great. Do you know, I don't know why then when they release like subsequent editions they don't use that painting. I suppose it's just publishing trends or like keeping up with the times, but I just love this edition. Even though it's very battered, I'll be hanging on to it. So anyways, what the book is about is it's set in the 1950s, so I suppose it's kind of set in two areas. It's set in a town in rural Dublin called Knocknagow, and then there's the part that's set in Dublin City. But I'd say the heart of the book is definitely in Knocknagow. So the two main characters are called Benny and Evie. So Benny is kind of, I suppose, a daughter of one of the main families in the town. Her family owns the local department store, and then Evie has been raised by the nuns in the local convent because she's an orphan. So obviously they have very different social backgrounds. So Benny's parents have saved money to send her to Dublin to go to college in UCD, and Evie is sent to Dublin also, but to find work as a secretary because the nuns don't have the money to send her to college. Follows them as they kind of encounter people up there. On Benny's first day of college, kind of there's an incident that happens that sets off a chain of a lot of the other events in the book. So the characters in this were so wonderful. I really liked Evie. I liked Benny as well, but I preferred Evie. I love the portrayal of like college life in the 1950s. That's when Maeve Binchy went to college, so you'd assume she knew what she was writing about. Things like all the country students staying up in the big city in the digs, being being cooked their dinners and that. The characters kind of go to like actual like dinner dances and how they get dressed up, and I suppose just like that kind of older college type of life. So I loved the relationship between the characters. If you like a book about friendship, like this is really definitely it. Like even when Evie and Benny are down different pathways, they still stay friends and mind one another. I really liked the small town setting. A big part of it is Benny's shop and kind of how they try to stay current. They kind of are given out about everybody going to do their shopping in Dublin when they'd rather like they stayed local and supported the local traditional businesses, which is I suppose topical. Another big aspect of it, I suppose, is Evie is an orphan, but her mother was actually from this wealthy aristocratic family, but Evie won't really have anything to do with them because they wouldn't accept her mother's marriage to her father, which is why she's in the convent. So I really liked Evie's journey there as well. About Benny's college experience, one thing I thought was interesting is Benny, because she lived quite close to college, she had to come home every night, which isn't something you see that often in books that do deal with colleges, but is a very common thing in Ireland, and we're quite a small country, and a lot of people would go to college in the nearest city to them and would drive in and out every day or get the bus. Another thing I'd like to say is this book is absolutely roll on the floor laughing. It was exactly my type of humour. However, I have to give one massive warning for this book, and that's if you have any kind of difficulties with food or eating, I wouldn't go near it with a 10-foot pole. It was released in 1990, and honestly, Benny struggles with self-image and her weight a lot, and she doesn't deal with it in a very healthy way, and there's no good lessons to be found in this book. So yeah, with that big caveat, I would highly recommend The Circle of Friends for everything else. Such a funny, heartwarming book filled with characters. I raced through it. Yeah, I can't wait to pick up more Maeve Binchy. So that's it. That's all the books I read for the Irish Readathon. Let me know what you read for the Irish Readathon if you did participate. And yeah, it did get me thinking about how much I enjoy Irish books. Like, obviously I won't be reading all Irish every month, but maybe I could target one Irish book a month. Might be nice. So yeah, and I do have that non-fiction book that I'll be reading in bits as well that I didn't get to from my TBR. So yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday for my next video.